Hi, I'd like to talk with you a little bit about plot today. Now, I know that you already have a good sense of what the plot of a story is, but in order to make sure that we're all on the same page and that we're looking at plot a little bit more critically than maybe you have in the past, I'd like for you to go through these notes. I will try to keep my commentary more specific, and I will be adding to the highlighted or to the points that you'll be writing or taking notes on. So to begin, we're going to talk about conflict. And I know you know conflict, but we tend to muddy the waters with the 5 different types of conflict. So we're going to narrow it down to 3 for our purposes. The first conflict, of course, is person against person. We see this in a lot of different stories. All good and evil, but it doesn't have to be just good and evil. It can be any number of person versus person conflicts. We have person against environment. Now, environment is where we see a lot of the extras in the other types of conflict that you may have learned about when you were younger. Environment includes place, it includes society, it includes technology, it includes fate, or any other kind of higher order. So we are lumping all of that into this idea that an environment can work against the protagonist of the story. And then, of course, you have person against self. So that one should be pretty well known. Just to clarify, I already used one of these terms. The protagonist is the central character in a conflict. The antagonist is any force arrayed against the protagonist. So anything that the protagonist has to face is an antagonist. Now, please understand the protagonist isn't a good guy necessarily, and he isn't a bad guy necessarily, nor is the antagonist a bad guy. So we have to get out of that concept that protagonist means good and antagonist means bad, because nature can be antagonistic toward a character who is in conflict with his environment. So consider these a little bit more broadly. We also have, the when we talk about heroes, we have the anti-heroes, those characters who appear heroic or who seem like they are on the right side of things, but are maybe going about it in a very different manner. So be thinking more about who is the central character, which character has the most going against him or her, and then what are those forces that are working against him or her. We want to look for the elements of suspense. Now, when we talk about suspense, generally we think about murder mysteries and horror and things like that, but really suspense is any element of mystery. It's the unusual set of circumstances, and we want the explanation for that. So anything in a story that inspires the question, or inspires the idea, I want to know what happens next, is suspense. And that is necessary for a good story, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be like the lurking in the corners and the shadowy suspects and things like that. Suspense can be a number of different things, anything that piques our curiosity. We will often come across dilemmas, which is a position in which the protagonist must choose between 2 courses of action, both of which are undesirable. This is what presents the dilemma. The character has to make a choice, but doesn't necessarily want to make the choice. And so then we watch to see how that choice affects the character, but also why the character makes the choice in the first place. This is something that adds suspense. So an important thing to consider is, why do things happen the way they do? A discerning reader, when we're reading critically, is going to be asking that. Why are things going the way they are? Not, well, I wonder what's going to happen next. And this is important when we're talking about suspense, because you're looking at the reasons why. What is the author trying to do that will help deepen the meaning or our understanding of the text? So, when we talk about plot, sometimes stories have a surprise ending. And you have to be conscientious that typically, if there's a surprise ending, there needs to be a reason for it. It shouldn't just be something that happens out of the blue. So, you want to consider one, the fairness with which it is achieved. So, is this something that is reasonable to the text as a whole? And two, the purpose which it serves. So, why was there the surprise? Why does that ending happen the way it does? And the worthwhile surprise is one that furnishes illumination and is not just a reversal of expectations. So, when we talk about those surprise endings, the last minute reprieve, or the character finding out all of a sudden that it was all a dream, those things have to be explained or at least hinted at throughout the story. At the end, you should be able to look back on the story and say, oh, I see how the author achieved this ending or arrived at this ending. And this is important too, that a discriminating reader evaluates an ending not by whether it is happy or unhappy, but by whether it is logical in terms of what precedes it and by the fullness of the revelation it affords. Now, the parts I underlined are the most significant parts of that statement. But I want you to consider, we as a society like happy endings. It's why we talk about Disney endings and how stories, when books are made into movies, sometimes the ending is different because we like those Hollywood happy endings. But when we're reading critical literature, I'm going to tell you right now, a lot of the endings are not happy. And it's important to understand that that doesn't make a good story. A happy ending doesn't necessarily make a story good. What makes a story good is the ending reasonable for what happened throughout the text. Which means that a story can have an indeterminate ending. One where there isn't a specific conclusion. Now, there's going to be some kind of concluding action or idea, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the whole story will be resolved. A couple of stories that highlight this kind of ending are The Awakening by Kate Chopin and The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. Both leave the ending a little bit up for grabs, and it's important that it is because it is intended to make you think, and it's also intended to question everything that the story has been leading up to. So even though the ending isn't completely conclusive, it still is there in order to provide thought or a thought-provoking idea. Some of you might remember The Giver from your youth and how that story has a fairly indeterminate ending. So consider that when you're looking at the endings of stories, that it may not be completely tied up in a nice, neat bow, but it's important for a reason. And if it isn't, then you need to question the legitimacy of the ending. So when we talk about plot, artistic unity is essential. In literary fiction, which is what we're going to be looking at this year, everything must contribute to the meaning of the work. And we're going to talk about that statement a lot, the meaning of the work as a whole. And so you look at how the author takes the characters and the plot and the themes and the figurative language and all of the details, and everything is working toward this artistic unity. So when we read popular fiction, usually that's the case too for good popular fiction. Everything has to fit together. But sometimes with popular fiction, you'll have little trails that sometimes don't come to much meaning in the end. So just something to consider. It's not a negative thing about popular fiction. I love popular fiction. It's just something that we tend to see. This is a term I want you to commit to memory. Deus ex machina. No, it's not the movie. I don't know where they got the movie, but Deus ex machina literally translates, it's ancient Greek, translates God from the machine. And what we use it for today is when the ending of a story is contrived or manipulated. So let me explain. In ancient Greek times, when they did theater, I mean, the most popular form of literature was theater, and people would get together for days on end and watch these series of plays, and it was a really important civic duty to go to the theater. Well, a lot of the time, the ancient Greek playwrights would write themselves into a proverbial corner where there wasn't really a good resolution. And if they did that, what they would end up doing is having a god like Apollo or Athena come down from Olympus and resolve the conflict. And it was a nice, neat ending, but rather contrived. And in the ancient Greek theater, they actually had a crane that they would have behind the set, essentially, that would lower the actor that was playing Athena or Apollo or whichever god onto the stage. And that's why it was God from the machine. The machine lowered the god onto the stage, the god solved all the problems, and the play ended. What we use it for now is, again, that last minute reprieve, the letter that comes in that declares that the prisoner on death row was actually innocent, or the letter that shows that everything, like the villain was lying and that the hero was right and good and everybody can live happily ever after. And so it's those endings that we feel like that last second save, and we kind of feel like we've been cheated to some extent in some cases. And in other cases, it provides that happy ending that makes us feel good. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that the ending is achieved by means that are not necessarily true to the text. And we will be talking about ancient Greek plays, Antigone and Oedipus, particularly Agamemnon and Electra. And in some cases, these plays, even though they're considered quality literature, do have these contrived endings. Last thing. When we talk about coincidence in stories, in literature, it can be acceptable in some situations, but I think you'll find that most good writers will not use coincidence because typically it's fairly unbelievable. Like, there are just times that things are not that coincidentally perfect. So just be aware of coincidence. Don't discount it, but know that it's not always the most, it's not always the best tactic.